Welcome to 3 Peas in a Pod, episode 219. We made it.
We did.
Yeah, it's if you are shocked to hear my voice right at the beginning, that's because Jason is not here with us.
Jason's not here today, but we are faithful to keep our schedule and get this done.
That is correct. So we decided to. I actually thought before.
I just like to point out that I've done now podcasts without you, and I've done podcasts without Jason.
I've never done a podcast without Jason.
I haven't either until right now.
Oh, gotcha.
But
I've done.
I'm the faithful one.
No, that's not true because the famous one is Jason and I did one the week of COVID.
I caused COVID.
You caused COVID. You were at spring training, I believe.
Yeah, that's the last time I've been to spring training.
That's true.
So that another pandemic. I am saving the world actively.
That's right. You're holding on. That's what my wife says about all the time. She worries about me getting into car crashes, and she has saved my life all the times I haven't been in car crashes. She's prevented such
I can
things.
no longer go to spring training. Another pandemic will happen.
That is true. That is strange because I know that was, not a long time, but I bet 3 or 4 years in a row you and Mom went to spring training. Yeah, but y'all have not been since.
Watching Major League ball players in high school stadiums is fun.
Well, there you go. But the MLB has started back. Is that correct?
They have.
At the point that we're filming this,
The Braves won 2 out of 3 the first weekend.
Good for the Braves.
In Philadelphia.
Wow.
Where we lost the last 2 years of the playoffs.
There we go. Well, that bodes well going into the future because baseball is definitely not a long season where everything can change.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we Braves Twitter first 2 days. Everybody's going undefeated.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Sunday, we lost. We may never win again.
Yeah, exactly. So
Twitter's a place where the level opinions.
Yeah.
Basketball's like very level.
80-something games. How much is baseball? 180?
162.
160.
So we have 159 to go.
There you go. Got a lot more to go. But we've got a lot to cover on this week's episode. We thought with Jason out of here, we do a little spring cleaning because the 2 least long-winded people are going to answer the most
Rapid
questions.
Fire.
Yeah. We had a bunch of questions come in that we thought were short answers. And we're going to do kind of a what they call mailbag episodes on other podcasts.
We get letters.
That's right.
Lots of letters.
We don't have a mailbag, but
No.
I have this piece of paper with it written down. And we're going to get through as many as we can. So what our plan is, we're going to film 3 in a row today, and our plan is to clear the deck. So we're going to need more questions. So make sure you use the form in the description to send those to us. So let's get started with the first question here, which is from Anonymous.
Corey, our most favorite viewer.
Yes. When we are called to reconcile one to another, is there right and wrong ways of doing that? Is a face-to-face apology enough? Or does it require more? If so, how much more? This is going to be a short answer because the answer is we just talked about this.
Yeah, no, I thought, man, I'm having deja vu again.
Yeah, it's a pretty recent thing. And I actually think this question is very, very similar to the conversation we had. Episode 213, which is pretty recent to what we're filming right now, is about what is the right way to say you're sorry.
I'll say the difference between apologies and reconciling, and I think we say that on the other one. I just like to be really, really clear with people. You cannot guarantee reconciliation.
Correct.
I can guarantee that I can apologize. I can guarantee that I'm sorry. I can try to do things differently. That doesn't mean that the other person wants to reconcile with me, or honestly, that if they haven't yet owned their part of it, if there was a part of it that we can be reconciled.
That's right. And that's why I think, forgiveness is a command that is really our responsibility of when someone owes me a debt, they've wronged me, they've done something wrong to me, and that has put me in a position where they now owe me something. My job is to, as quickly as I can, and forgiveness is a process, but as quickly as I can, to release them of that debt. I'm not going to get back at you. I'm not going to hold anger towards you. I'm going to return back to I want what's best for you, loving posture. But reconciliation, as Ed's talking about, is both parties saying, we want to make this work. We both want to make this work. And we've said this before about even God's relationship. When Jesus died on the cross and rose again, God has forgiven sins. He's no longer counting sins. Reconciliation is something that happens when we say, I want to be made right with God.
That's right.
And so I actually think the church is not only the ones given the ministry of reconciliation, but it really is in the church where the expectation of reconciliation should be rather high, because unlike in many families where there are other people who are not believers in the family, reconciliation is difficult when both people don't always want it. But in the church, the reason Paul talks a lot about us reconciling with one another is we are going to offend one another. We are going to hurt one another. But both of us are living in a state of reconciliation already. We should be able to say, hey, this is a priority for us to work it out. And so anyway, we have that episode of how to apologize, how to go about reconciling, episode 213. You can watch that if you want more. And Jason will be on that, so it's probably better.
Yeah.
So, all right, second question here. Why did you stop putting the titles of the songs on screen during Sunday services? Nathan did an amazing duet last week. Can you please tell me the name of it? Thank you. Now, here's the problem. I did a duet with another person named Nathan.
The Nathans.
Yeah, so I don't know if they're saying I did an amazing part in the duet or if the other person was so good they made up for my part in the duet. The first question, why did you stop putting the titles of the songs? We stopped doing that a long time ago. I can't remember when, but certainly.
This is the first song they cared about.
This is the first one they actually wanted to know.
In a long time.
And the simple answer is, it was just a choice that was made when we switched softwares of our presenting software. You had to go in and make a choice to tell it, the software, to put up the song titles. I was the one making the decision, and I said that does not matter to me, so we don't. There is nothing beyond that. Does not matter to me. I don't. I can tell you the name of the song. I do remember the duet. It's called Something/Nothing, or it might be Nothing/Something. I cannot remember the order it goes in. Charlie's nodding his head. And are you saying you know which one it is?
I'm pretty sure it's Nothing/Something.
Okay, Charlie thinks it's Nothing/Something by Pat Barrett.
Pat Barrett.
So, and I believe Dante Bowe is the name of the other artist. I think he's from Maverick City Music.
Maverick City.
And he also sings that song. So that's where you can
Pat
find
Barrett, one of our now favorite.
Yeah, we sing a lot of Pat Barrett.
We sing a
lot of Pat Barrett, a lot of Phil Wickham. I would say that in general, if you hear a song on Sunday, checking Phil Wickham, Pat Barrett, or Hillsong, those are probably the three most popular of what we do. So there you go. Let's go to this one. What is the significance of mentioning that Simon from Cyrene helped Jesus to carry his cross? So the person is referencing the fact that, and we looked this up before, the three, what they call synoptic
gospels.
Synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which that's because they all cover basically the same material in Jesus' life. Matthew has more than Mark, and Luke has a few different from Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark often have the exact same stories. Matthew sometimes will have extra details than Mark did. And Matthew has a few stories that Mark didn't.
And they sometimes are in different orders.
Correct.
Yeah.
And Matthew tends to have more parables than any of the other Gospels. Luke has parables that are some that are different. So, but they're called the synoptics because they tend to cover the same kind of pattern in Jesus' life. John's is kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I think that, I don't know that there's no real consensus on why the Gospels are the way they are, other than most people believe there was a long time. In fact, I think it just changed probably right before I was in school to study the Bible. Most people believe Matthew was the first gospel. That's why it was first. But pretty much now everybody agrees Mark was the first one written.
That's what I've heard.
Matthew is second. Luke is written. He and John may be written around the same period of time, maybe a little bit earlier than John, but John's the one that pretty clear about it. I mean, Luke and John are the ones that are real clear about their purpose. Luke says, I'm trying to do it orderly.
Right.
I mean, he's the only Gentile. He's a doctor. He says, I'm trying to do all of this just in order. And he's writing it for people, a person. I can't remember what that's called in Roman culture, but there was a person that would pay you.
Yeah, the patronage
Patronage kind
Yeah.
of thing. So both Luke and Acts are written to this same person.
Yes.
And he's trying to do a great job to earn the money that he's been offered to write this down. And then John says, I'm writing these things so you'll believe. I'm
That's
only
right.
telling you. And he says, there's a lot of other stuff I could have written, but I think I've given you enough that if you read this.
I think it's why for modern readers, John is some of the easiest to read. John's honestly flows a little bit more like a modern novel in that he really highlights these 7 signs,
Mhm.
and it's really centered around that. And then there's this, he has the most material in Jesus' final week of his life, and that he's got this really long discourse that Jesus has in the final moment. And it reads less like a history book
Right.
and more like a novel where he's really trying to say something about Jesus. Matthew and Mark, and a lot of people think that the reason they think Mark is first is that Matthew probably used Mark as a source when he was writing, because Matthew was there, Mark was not there.
That's right.
And so Matthew looks at what Mark's already written and goes, okay, I'm going to tell that. And I'm going to tell some details, not that Mark got wrong, that Mark just didn't include. And so he includes more stuff. And so people think, well, probably the reason Mark is first is that Matthew had to have used it because of how close it was.
There's another thing that I think we don't really get. And I was reading this in a book about the Bible and the books and those kind of things, maybe a year or so ago. We tend to think of the writing supplies as being readily available. They're everywhere else when we think about it. They weren't ready available.
Correct.
And even some of the letters that are of different lengths, they often are just filling the space
page that they have.
And so this is not anybody that said this, but I've thought about Mark's pretty early. Most people believe
Yes.
pretty early. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, because of some things he says about the destruction of Jerusalem that a lot of people in the 20th century took about the return of Christ.
Well,
but not about the return of Christ. It's
Yes.
about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
And I've even been hearing that it's probably even earlier than people are thinking, because now they're beginning to think that Luke is pretty early, like somewhere in the 50s, because the book of Acts, which is written after Luke, doesn't mention Paul's death.
Paul's not dead yet.
And so they think, well, the reason, and they mention that Paul is on trial, so why would you not end with his death? So it's likely that Luke is actually earlier than we thought, which means Mark is probably earlier than that.
That's right. So I'm just thinking, Mark's writing really early. Christianity's not big yet. They probably don't have a lot of collective wealth yet.
Right.
But as you get further along, they probably have a few more wealthy people that come to be able to pay for some of these things to make sure this stuff, gets recorded, all that kind of stuff. But you even see that in some of Paul's letters and that they seem, they're often you just go, well, that ended sort of abruptly.
That's right.
But
yeah, they realized we got to the end of the page and we got to be done.
Yeah, we're done. We don't have much. So back to Simon of Cyrene. We got off of the gospel.
He's mentioned in the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I believe the reason why, the significance behind it, is that this is something that happened. This is just another way of them trying to be accurate to what happened. There probably is, because the more that I read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there may be even some symbolic significance to it. But the greatest significance is this is something that happened. And as we were talking about before, I think part of the reason Mark is so short is because it feels as if Mark, because it's so early, someone's trying to just get this stuff written down, because at least by the time he's writing it, even though Christianity isn't huge, it has grown outside of Jerusalem, and you have all these little churches around. They want to be able to spread out accurate stories for the preachers and the people in those churches to say, hey, these are the stories. These are the things about Jesus' life that we want to imitate. And so the reason they probably include Simon from Cyrene is he was probably a follower that was in one of those churches. And
that's what I've always heard, is that he was probably a follower. A lot of, Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians, a bunch of people by name says, you can talk to them about these events. And I think that's often what's happening. They're mentioning people. who are still alive, to the earliest followers.
Like Joseph of Arimathea,
Yeah.
who gives up his tomb for
Yeah.
Jesus' body. The reason they mention that is so that they can go and go, hey, did you actually give your tomb? And that's
That's
a
right.
good sign that Jesus did
Mhm.
rise from the dead, you know. So I think that's an important, and I think honestly that's a critical part. Maybe that'll go to our final question here. Whenever you're even reading the Gospels, we tend to read them with such distance from them. And what I mean is, we read, all historians for us have such distance from what they're writing about that it's almost like, hey, someone just needs to write everything that happened so that people can know what happened. They were not writing just so that there would be a record of Jesus' life.
Mhm.
They were writing to churches with the intention of, and which is why they each highlight different things. You mentioned Luke being a Gentile. Luke mentions more foreigners and outsiders because that was his heart.
That's
He
right.
goes, I love the fact that Jesus included Gentiles like me.
From
So-
the beginning, not just in the end. He
Right.
was always doing it.
and so
Yeah.
he mentions lots of that. And Matthew, who had been a Jewish boy, but because he was a tax collector, had been outside the Jewish faith, mentions way more Old Testament prophecies and things
Mhm.
like that, because he's trying to highlight the Jewishness of Jesus, of the Messiah, this long fulfillment of the Old Testament. They're each highlighting different things for, not for, we say like posterity, like
Right.
that it would just be out there.
I don't think any of them had any way to think
In
this-
2,000
that
years.
the pieces of paper they were writing were going to stay.
Yes.
Because they're an oral culture. They might have thought the stories were going to stay
Yes.
and that they would get repeated. They probably did think that. And so they're giving details so that they could be repeated in a certain
Well,
way.
and all of the scripture, that was the way they treated scripture, because even the scriptures they had written out, the Old Testament, not all of them could physically sit and read those, but they would go to the synagogues, or they'd been in Hebrew school where they had been taught to memorize sections. The way that they read the Bible was, these are stories that form us as people. They form how we think about the world, how we think about God, how we think about other people. And all of Jesus's life, in many ways, is referential to things that happened in the Old Testament. It's this idea of, we're going to tell these stories over and over again, and they will form the way you think about God and the way you think about the world around you and other people and how you should live. And so they are primarily writing even these historical accounts. Even Luke, who's writing an orderly historical account, he's doing so with theology in mind. He's
Mhm.
doing it not just for historical purposes, but for the sake of, he wants to be able to give to churches a way to think about the life of Jesus, what that says about God, what that says about me and you, and how we should relate. And so this kind of goes into our final question here, which is about a specific story out of the book of Luke. And the question is, what is the meaning of Luke 16, 1 through 9? So Ed's going to read that story for the sake of people who don't just off the top of their head. Like me, I had to look up what is Luke 16, 1 through 9. But this is a fairly, I wouldn't say popular parable.
I think it's one of the, and I believe, Luke 15 is always, it's one of my favorite passages, parable of the prodigal son,
Lost
has
sheep, lost coin.
Those are the two before. I personally have always wondered if this story wasn't the fourth story told.
Mm.
Now, typically Jesus does do things in threes, but it just goes right into it, the chapter division. So here it is. We get done with the parable of the prodigal son. It says, Jesus told this story to his disciples. Now, you may remember that the other three are directed at the crowds.
Pharisees and the crowds. Yeah.
The crowds and the Pharisees have been asking, why do you hang out with sinners? So Jesus told this story to his disciples. There was a certain rich man who had a manager handling his affairs. One day a report came that the manager was wasting his employer's money. So the employer called him and said, "What's this I hear about you? Get your report in order because you're going to be fired." The manager thought to himself, "Now, what? My boss has fired me? I don't have the strength to dig ditches. I'm too proud to beg. I know how to ensure that I'll have plenty of friends who will give me a home when I'm fired." So he invited each person who owed money to his employer to come and discuss the situation. He asked the first one, "How much do you owe him?" The man replied, "I owe him 800 gallons of olive oil." So the manager told him, "Take the bill, quickly change it to 400 gallons. And how much do you owe my employer? He asked the next man. I owe him 1,000 bushels a week, was the reply. Here, the manager said, take the bill, change it to 800 bushels. The rich man had to admire the dishonest rascal for being so shrewd. And it's true that the children of this world are more shrewd in dealing with the world around them than are the children of light. Here's the lesson. Use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. Then when your possessions are gone, they will welcome you to an eternal home. If you're faithful in little things, you'll be faithful in large ones. But if you're dishonest in little things, you'll be dishonest with greater responsibilities. And if you're untrustworthy about worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches of heaven? And if you're not faithful with other people's things, why should you be trusted with things of your own? No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. And then I think this is a verse because it's right after the parable that people miss. The Pharisees, who dearly loved their money, heard all of this and scoffed at him. They said to him, you like to appear righteous and then he, no, I'm sorry. The Pharisees who dearly loved their money heard all of this and scoffed at him. Then he said to them, you like to appear righteous in public, but God knows your heart. What this world honors is detestable in the sight of God. So, this parable and the verse they were asking about, I'm guessing, is verse 9.
Well, they said 1 through 9.
Okay.
So I'm assuming.
I read all the way through the end of the parable and the lesson that Jesus gives, and right after. So verse 9 in this translation, which is the New Living, is where he gives the lesson. Use your worldly resources to benefit others and make friends. I'm going to read it in another translation, which I bet they probably read it in, probably the New International, or let's hope not the King James, but maybe the King James. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, that when it's gone, you'll be welcomed in eternal dwellings. And of course, the thing before that is Jesus saying people in the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of light.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people get tangled up on this parable because
the guy that he's praising is a dishonest person.
Really not a good guy. In fact, I love the New Living called him a rascal.
Yes.
Yeah, he's a guy that, but what Jesus is he's praising the shrewdness of
Correct.
the guy. And the way I have thought about this parable, and I think I've taught it this way in years past, is this guy realizes my boss has already told me I'm going to be fired, get the records in order.
Limited time.
I have a little bit of time, and which gives me a little bit of opportunity to do something.
Yes.
This time gives me opportunity. And he realizes that the boss even comes and praises him for using both his opportunity and his time. And Jesus is saying to people about money, this is a parable directly about money,
Mm-hmm.
that you should realize you have a little bit of time
Mm-hmm.
to make use of this thing you have, this opportunity. Money
Mm-hmm.
is an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
You have a little bit of time to make the most use of it. And what he says is you should use it in a way so that when you run out of money and time, both of those will run out.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you will.
Mm-hmm.
It's the old statement that somebody made when J.P. Morgan died. They said, how much did he leave behind? The answer is all of it.
Right.
He left all of it behind. When your time runs out, your money
Yes.
is also run out.
Yes.
And so Jesus is saying, you make the limited amount of opportunity you have with your money to make the best investment you can make, which is in eternity, to win people for eternity, so that when you get to the other side, you have friends there.
Well, and I think, yeah, so I agree with all that. I think one of the things that we miss because of our culture that we live in, when Jesus talks about winning friends, this was actually something, he was not actually telling them a story that didn't make sense to them.
No.
Because their culture is one we think of the greatest way to secure your future is to get enough money. You don't need friends when you have lots of money. But their culture in collectivist societies, you think about it in terms of like the Godfather movies, where you have this really high up patriarchy godfather figure. You come, he does a favor for you, and you're going to do a favor back when it's his turn. What he's describing is the way those kind of friendships work. And this is still this way in the Middle East right now, in collectivist societies where they talk about, I read a book called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. I think you've read that book as well. And there's another book they wrote called Misreading Scripture with Individualist Eyes.
Right.
Because they are ministers in Muslim countries like Indonesia and places, I can't remember who the other one, maybe Saudi Arabia. But they talk about in our culture, the idea of gifts coming with strings attached is a negative. I don't want to be tied to you. Just give me the gift. Don't expect anything. That he says in these countries that are very collectivist, he says you want gifts to come with strings attached. That this guy who goes, hey, I just helped you out. The person he helped out will, in response, it's almost like making a financial investment. That guy's like, well, you helped me out of 400 gallons of stuff. I will help you when you're poor, and I will make sure you're not homeless. And Jesus is actually trying to set up this thing. Now, I say all of that to say, going back to the point we said earlier, this is not just a historical thing. I do believe Jesus taught this parable. But I believe the reason Luke includes this is because he's writing to churches. And what we see in the book of Acts is that these early churches were making it a regular habit that when there was need among them, they would sell their possessions and give to those in need, that they saw each other as we are friends of Jesus and we are friends of God and we are friends and brothers and sisters with one another. And so when Jesus says this thing...
And to be clear about that, not just in their local communities. We know Paul is going around to churches all over the area to take money back to Jerusalem to people they've never met.
Well, and in Romans, he says, I want to go, and I think people believe it's Spain that he's trying to get to, what we now call Spain. And he goes, I need money to go to these other places to preach the gospel to them. And this is a common thing for them to say, hey, we're going to use these worldly resources, not for our own benefit, but we're going to get crafty about it. We're going to get shrewd about it to help other people and then when I'm out of money, which is always the fear. I mean, for all of us, right? The fear is if I give too much, who's going to take care of me? I believe the point of Jesus' sermon is when you are in this church community, it's not like this grand out there mystical idea that if you just give away, God's going to take care of you. You don't have to worry about it. I think he's making a practical thing. Use your worldly resources among one another, and you have these people, and they're going to help you. And God honors that, and God sees that. I think often we look at, and I hear a lot of preachers do this, but I hear a lot of people do it too. We look at these kind of stories as almost like these mystical principles that God's like, if you just, it's to me of this idea of, you put your 10% down, you're going to get tenfold back, you're going to get this, whatever the thing is. Almost like people saying, put good energy out into the universe.
That's right.
Somehow, just by karma, it's coming back on you, or God's going to just throw it back on you. I believe Jesus is trying to describe a way of life, which is the point of this life, as Jason preached out of the other parable Jesus told, it's not about building bigger barns.
That's right.
The point is not to gain all this money. What if instead of being crafty, as he's talking about this guy's being crafty to make sure he's physically taken care of. What if you were crafty because you already know you're going to be physically taken care of, and you could be crafty in how you take care of other people?
Well, that's why I think the parable is the fourth of the ones. If you remember at the beginning, they're critical of Jesus hanging out with these no good people.
Right.
He goes through the thing. The one brother takes the guy's inheritance. The other brother complains that he didn't get any, even though it says at the beginning of the parable, he divided among both of them.
Yeah, he gave it to both of them.
He gave it to both of them, but he complains. It's a money parable. He follows with this, and at the end of it, he says to him, you can't serve two masters. And the Pharisees get it. They're upset.
They know he's talking about
he's
us.
Pointing back to, these people you're complaining about, they're your brothers and sisters. They are image of God bearers. And you don't care about them, but you do care about money. And this guy was at least shrewd enough that you ought to see to use your money for the sake of other people. Because again, the thing you're talking about, and this is a serious thing for me and where I'm at in life these days of just thinking about, I either trust that God is taking care of me all my life. I've been on the payroll of a church for a long, long time.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
and I get that's a different thing for most people, but God has literally, I've made much less money than other people with similar levels of education that I have. And God has taken care of me. I either trust that that's going to continue,
Yes.
or I believe somehow that I earned by my own smart on
Mhm.
less money than other people made a way that I can take care of myself. In
Mhm.
we have to, as followers of Christ, continually say, the Father takes care of me. The
Right.
Father is, the Lord is my shepherd.
Mhm.
I believe that the Lord will take care of me. He will lead me to green pastures. And so money is something that I use, yes, for my benefit. I'm not supposed to
Sure,
squander
sure.
it, but for the benefit. Everything that comes to me is not for me.
Well, and I 100%, and I think that's the point that the Jesus is actually in a strange way, he's not praising the motivation of this person.
No.
He is praising the way in which this person is shrewd or crafty or creative in this wise sense of, man, they thought of something no one else ever thought of doing. And he's saying that's how you approach it. But the difference is he's saying, because he then says, if you're dishonest with the little, so it's not the dishonesty that's being praised.
Mm-mm.
What's being praised is what you said. This guy knows I have a limited amount of time, just like we have a limited amount of time on this earth. And he goes, I've got to find a way to use these opportunities
The
and
stuff that
resources.
God has given,
Mhm.
time isn't mine.
Correct.
That is a gift. Every breath of air I suck belongs to God. Every dollar I have belongs to God. And this guy just came to that conclusion for a bad reason.
That's right. He had a bad
He had a
reason.
bad reason. Bad things happen. He realized I've got a limited amount of time. The sad things for lots of us that are followers of Christ is we don't use the good reason of we know we have limited time. We know the Father has blessed us, or we get blinded by the American economy and thinking somehow I did it.
Right.
And we have to just own the fact I have limited time, limited opportunity. I must use them for the benefit of the kingdom.
That's right. And if I do this for the sake of other people, and I do this within a community of
Yes.
other people that are doing that, then if for some reason, because this is always the fear, right, is I'm going to give money that maybe I should have saved, which once again, you should be wise in your savings. But there is a level of savings that isn't wise. It's building bigger barns. There's wise savings, and then there's let me just keep building bigger barns. And the fear is if I don't keep building bigger barns, then when a storm comes, I'm going to be left out. But if I'm in a community where I have been taking care of others and with the money I have and I'm doing good for other people, then I think what Jesus would say is, then if some storm does come that you couldn't foresee, right? Wouldn't those people then, because they're your friends, would they not then help take care of you? What happens, the pride that gets into us is, I want to be the one who helps, not the one who needs help.
Yeah.
And that, what if I get to a place where, because my wife and I talk about that, we have 4 daughters, we have, an emergency fund and we have our wise savings, but then there comes times where you go, maybe we should put even more aside.
That's right.
Just in case, and then you start, just in case one of us gets this like horrible disease. And I go, if that happens, do I not believe in my brothers and sisters in Christ to look at me and go, hey, this is a bizarre circumstance. Of course we will. It's not, hey, you can't pay for your kid to have shoes today because you squandered it on 32 different cruises.
Right.
It's, hey, this person, you've been wise and you've been generous and you've been doing all the things God, but unfortunately this thing has happened to you. We love you. And the fear I always have is, but I don't want to have to go and ask anyone for help.
Yeah. Which also is violating a principle of God.
Right. And so
it just is me not wanting to learn the one thing that I personally have the hardest thing learning is humility.
right.
I don't want to be the one. I do want to be the one helping. I don't want to be the one in need. I'm willing to do anything for you. I don't need anything.
That's right.
That's just pride.
And in a family, that's not the way it works, because what families do for one another, sometimes I'm the one who needs to be served. Sometimes I'm the one who can serve. What is important, and this is what Jesus says, to be faithful with what's given to you. So when I am the one who can help, I should help. And when I am the one who should be asking for help, I should ask for help. It's, are you faithful with the circumstance that got placed before you? So much of our life, and we've said this in the series we've been in, is we think I should be the author of my story. I should be the one who, pulls myself up by my bootstraps and makes it so no matter what happens, I'm in control. But so much of Jesus' life, and I know you're going to talk about this at this point, it may have already come up in a sermon, is us learning that eventually, someone's going to take you where you don't want to go. That a lot of your life, but that's also true for Jesus. That Jesus in his death, Jesus, though he willingly gave himself over, he did not decide how many lashes he got.
Mm-hmm.
He did not decide, we talked about Simon of Cyrene, that someone else was going to have, maybe that's the significance. Someone else had to help Jesus carry his cross.
Mm-hmm.
That there's some level of, a lot of what happens in Jesus' life is what is happening to him. Now, he is willingly giving himself over because he could call angel armies down to stop it. But it is things that are happening to him. And it is Jesus saying, I will be faithful to the circumstance that's in front of me. And I think that's the point of this parable is when you're in a circumstance, you should be faithful with a little bit so you can be trusted with a lot. And I look at people in our world who, we were talking about this today in another meeting, people in our world who do not have financially, they are not as big of a benefit with the amount of money they give to an organization as someone else. But Jesus tells the story of the widow who gives two mites or two coins, where all these other people are giving more. And Jesus says, that's the person who has been faithful. That's the person who's done this. In the kingdom, that's the person that may in fact be over 10 cities, though in this life, you may not trust them to be over,
That's right.
over your pocketbook. Because you look and you go, well, they haven't, they haven't had as much money. Clearly, the person running, the CEO is the wise money manager. Right. And Jesus goes, maybe that person's the wise money manager because they've learned how to say, I can give away and do what Jesus has called me to do. And that maybe those of us who have had the speaking ability in the kingdom of heaven, maybe we'll find out we get to just be a servant where some of the people who haven't been in front leading things, they're the ones who were most faithful and no one saw it in this life. And they'll be, as Jesus says, they'll be running cities and they'll be running all these things. It's, can you be faithful with what you're given? So I think we answered that question. If not, send us more questions in. I'm sure we are over time. We said we were going to be shorter without Jason. I'm confident we were longer. Because one thing, Jason times these.
He has a little timer. We didn't run one.
I did not run a timer. So if everything we said made no sense, send us a question in or just send us in to say, please bring back Jason. You got at least 2 more episodes without him. Send us more questions in. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you next week.